The Holy Roman Empire is one of history's biggest paradoxes. It lasted for about 1,000 years, covered huge parts of Europe, and carried the language of universal authority, yet it was never a tightly centralized superstate in the way modern people imagine an empire. To understand it, we have to drop modern assumptions. This was a political world built on layered loyalties, negotiated authority, church legitimacy, and local rights that were fiercely protected. At different moments, the empire was a military powerhouse, a diplomatic framework, a legal umbrella, and sometimes little more than a title backed by tradition. It was called holy because it claimed a sacred mission in Christian Europe, Roman because it presented itself as heir to ancient imperial legitimacy, and empire because it stood above kings and princes in theory. But theory and practice were often far apart. This tension between grand claims and local realities is the key to everything that follows. If we treat the Holy Roman Empire as a failed nation-state, it looks confusing. If we treat it as a long-running political system for managing diversity in Central Europe, it starts to make sense. Its symbolic origin is usually tied to Christmas Day in the year 800, when Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne as emperor in Rome. That moment was dramatic because the Western imperial title had disappeared centuries earlier after the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476. By crowning Charlemagne, the papacy and Frankish power created a new claim, that imperial authority in the Christian West could be revived. But this revival did not produce a permanent, stable institution overnight. Charlemagne's realm was vast, yet after his dynasty fragmented, imperial continuity weakened and the title lapsed. So the year 800 is less the birth of a finished empire and more the opening chapter of a long experiment linking military kingship, Christian legitimacy, and Roman memory. The coronation also planted a recurring political question: who ultimately grants imperial authority, the pope through sacred ceremony, or rulers through military and dynastic power? This question would shape centuries of conflict and cooperation between emperors and church leaders. In other words, from the beginning, the empire was not just territory. It was an argument about legitimacy. A second foundational moment came in 962 when Otto of Saxony, later called Otto the Great, was crowned emperor by Pope John XII. This is often treated as the start of the empire in its durable medieval form. Otto was already king in the German lands, and imperial coronation elevated that kingship into a wider claim over Christendom and over territories linked to the old Carolingian world. Under Otto and his successors, the empire became one of Europe's strongest monarchic systems, but its strength depended on cooperation with powerful regional lords and bishops. Emperors could lead armies, grant lands, and shape high politics, yet they rarely governed every region directly. Instead, they relied on a web of vassals whose support had to be earned, rewarded, and constantly renegotiated. That made the imperial system resilient in some ways, because it distributed power, but also unstable, because loyalty was conditional. The emperor's authority was real, but it flowed through intermediaries, not through a centralized bureaucracy. This hybrid structure explains how the empire could project influence over wide areas while still remaining internally fragmented. At its broadest historical scope, the empire included the German kingdom as its political core, while also claiming authority in northern and central Italy and, from 1032, the Kingdom of Burgundy. Over time, its influence touched territories now found in Germany, Austria, the Czech Republic, Switzerland, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Slovenia, Liechtenstein, Monaco, and parts of France, Poland, and Italy. But this was not a neat block of contiguous national territory. Borders shifted, legal statuses differed, and local rulers retained inherited rights. Some regions were integrated deeply into imperial institutions, others were linked more loosely by feudal ties or diplomatic recognition. This unevenness mattered. It allowed the empire to be expansive without becoming uniformly governed, but it also made coherent long-term control difficult, especially in Italy and Burgundy. By the late medieval period, effective imperial governance had increasingly concentrated in German-speaking lands. So when people imagine a single empire dominating all of Central Europe from one capital, they miss the reality. this was a layered political space, with many centers of power operating under one imperial canopy. One of the empire's most distinctive features was that the imperial crown became elective rather than purely hereditary. In practice, a small group of high-ranking princes and archbishops, known as prince-electors, chose the king who would then pursue imperial coronation and authority. This system prevented automatic dynastic succession and forced candidates to bargain. Future emperors had to promise privileges, respect local liberties, and distribute offices or concessions to secure votes. That had major consequences. On one hand, it reduced the risk of a weak child inheriting uncontested power and gave elite stakeholders a mechanism to control the center. On the other hand, it entrenched oligarchic politics and made centralization harder. Electors were not just ceremonial voters, they were major territorial powers with their own agendas. The empire's political culture thus became one of contract, precedent, and negotiated hierarchy. Even when a powerful dynasty like the Habsburgs dominated elections for long stretches, formal elections still mattered as a constitutional principle. The emperor was supreme in rank, but not absolute in governance. Imperial authority had to be continuously manufactured through consensus, privilege, and political skill. The high medieval centuries, especially under the Hohenstaufen dynasty, brought both expansion and strain. Imperial rulers pushed hard to assert control across Germany and Italy, seeking prestige, revenue, and strategic dominance. For a time, this produced remarkable power. Yet the very scale of ambition created overextension. Italian campaigns consumed resources, provoked urban resistance, and deepened conflict with the papacy. Simultaneously, German princes consolidated their own territories and institutions, often using periods of weak kingship to become more autonomous. The result was not one dramatic collapse but a partial weakening of central command. The empire endured, but as a more negotiated and decentralized order. This is an important pattern in imperial history. Success at expansion can undermine the administrative capacity needed to hold gains. In the Holy Roman case, pursuing universal monarchy often strengthened regional actors at home. So even at moments of apparent dominance, structural limits were already visible. The empire could still mobilize legitimacy and force, but it increasingly did so through cooperation rather than command. Its survival came not from solving fragmentation, but from learning to operate inside it. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, imperial elites confronted a practical challenge: how do you keep such a fragmented system functional? The answer was a broad process known as imperial reform. These reforms did not create a modern centralized state, but they did build institutions that improved coordination, legal order, and conflict management across the empire. Mechanisms for common deliberation, legal adjudication, and territorial organization became more regularized. The empire increasingly acted as a constitutional framework where disputes could be processed rather than only fought. This institutional turn is often overlooked because it lacks the drama of conquest, but it was crucial for longevity. A decentralized empire can survive if it gives local actors predictable rules, forums, and incentives to stay inside the system. Reform made the empire less about direct command by one ruler and more about structured coexistence among many powers. In that sense, it evolved from a medieval personal monarchy into a complex political architecture. Not fully modern, not fully feudal, but something in between that remained durable for centuries. Religion and diplomacy also shaped imperial identity. The emperor was often described as first among equals among Catholic monarchs, a rank that conveyed precedence more than direct control over other kingdoms. This status mattered in ceremonies, negotiations, and ideological contests. Yet the empire's holy dimension was always politically charged. Papal recognition could enhance legitimacy, but popes and emperors frequently clashed over appointments, authority, and jurisdiction. The wider Christian order was never a calm partnership. Instead, it was a competitive ecosystem where spiritual and temporal claims overlapped. Inside the empire, ecclesiastical princes such as archbishops were not just churchmen, they were political actors with lands, armies, and votes in elections. This fusion of sacred and secular power made governance intricate. It also helps explain why imperial politics often looked slow and procedural. Many decisions required balancing legal rights, theological expectations, and territorial interests. The empire was not weak simply because it negotiated. Negotiation was its operating system. Its authority emerged through ritual, law, and bargaining as much as through battlefield victory. Over the early modern period, the empire became increasingly centered on German lands as effective control in Italy and Burgundy receded. This did not mean the old claims vanished overnight, but practical governance followed where institutions and political consensus were strongest. Dynasties, especially the Habsburgs, used imperial structures to pursue broader European strategies, while local territories within the empire developed stronger administrative identities of their own. Free cities, prince-bishoprics, duchies, and electorates all operated with varying degrees of autonomy under imperial law. This produced a patchwork political map unlike centralized France or later nation-states. Historians sometimes call this dysfunction, others see adaptive pluralism. Both views capture part of the truth. Fragmentation could slow collective action and invite foreign interference, but it also prevented total domination by a single center and preserved local political cultures. The Holy Roman Empire was not heading linearly toward modern nationalism. It represented an alternate trajectory where layered sovereignty persisted for centuries. Understanding that alternative helps explain why Central Europe's political development differed so much from Western absolutist models. The final crisis came during the Napoleonic era. French revolutionary and imperial warfare shattered older political balances across Europe, and the Holy Roman framework struggled to withstand the pressure. Napoleon reorganized German states into the Confederation of the Rhine, a French-aligned bloc that pulled key territories out of imperial structures. Faced with this new reality, Emperor Francis II abdicated the imperial title and formally dissolved the Holy Roman Empire on August 6, 1806. The end was abrupt in legal terms, but long prepared by structural trends, decentralization, external rivalry, and the rise of new state forms based on different principles of sovereignty. Still, dissolution did not erase the empire's legacy. Its legal traditions, territorial arrangements, and political habits influenced successor states across Central Europe. Many borders, institutions, and constitutional debates of the 19th century were shaped by imperial inheritances. So the empire did not vanish without residue, it transformed into the background architecture of modern European state-building. So what should we take from this thousand-year story? First, the Holy Roman Empire was not an absurd historical mistake, despite the famous joke that it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire in the conventional sense. It was a real system built for a world where legitimacy was shared, territory was layered, and political authority had to be negotiated across diversity. Second, longevity does not always come from centralization. The empire survived because it could absorb conflict, reconfigure institutions, and allow multiple centers of power to coexist under common rules. Third, its history challenges modern assumptions that successful governance must look like a unified nation-state. For most of European history, that was not the dominant model. The Holy Roman Empire reminds us that political order can be durable even when messy, decentralized, and constitutionally complex. In many ways, it was a laboratory of coexistence under constraint. To study it is to see Europe before nationalism fully remade the map, a continent where law, ritual, privilege, and negotiation could hold together an empire that was always fragile, yet remarkably persistent. If you found this helpful, please like this video and subscribe for more explainers.